This weapon could cut through bone, but that's not what made it dangerous. It was built with pieces of obsidian, volcanic glass, set into a wooden body, sharp enough to slice cleanly through flesh, and sharp enough that Spanish observers in the early 16th century described it as devastating in close combat, even claiming it could bring down a horse with a single strike. It should have been a weapon designed to end a fight immediately, but that assumption begins to break the moment you look at how it was actually used. When the Spanish arrived in central Mexico in 1519, what they encountered was not just an unfamiliar weapon, but a way of fighting that didn't follow the logic they expected. Again and again, accounts describe strikes that seemed incomplete, blows delivered without being fully carried through, opponents brought down and then not finished. At first, this could be dismissed as hesitation or even inefficiency, the kind of inconsistency you might expect in the chaos of close combat. But the pattern repeats too often across too many accounts to be accidental, and the weapon itself offers a clue. Obsidian is sharper than steel, but brittle. Under heavy impact, the blades could chip or break, leaving deep, irregular wounds instead of a clean, decisive cut. A lethal strike was always possible, but never guaranteed. And in this case, reliability wasn't the point, because the outcome of the encounter was not defined by the moment of impact, but by what happened after it. What mattered was not how many enemies were killed, but how many could be taken alive, and what could be done with them afterward. And this isn't based on a single account. Across codices, surviving records, and modern reconstructions, the same pattern appears again and again. The role of the weapon shifts once you see it this way. Instead of ending a fight, it controls it, injuring, weakening, and stopping just short of the final blow, separating the act of violence from the moment of death. And once you look at it that way, the earlier contradiction stops being a flaw. It becomes a system, one where violence doesn't end the moment it begins. The weapon was not failing to kill. It was being used to decide when killing would happen, and when it wouldn't. Which means that in some cases, the most important part of the encounter didn't happen on the battlefield at all. And in some places, the body didn't mark the end of the fight. It became part of what came after. More than 2,000 years ago, across the open expanse of the Eurasian steppe, the Scythians fought in ways that, at first glance, would have seemed familiar. Mounted archers, rapid movement, and direct, lethal encounters shaped by speed and distance. That impression doesn't hold for long, because here the act of killing was not always the final step. By the 5th century BCE, writers like Herodotus were already describing practices that extended beyond the moment of death. Scalps taken from fallen enemies, skin removed and preserved, and objects made from what should have been left behind. For a long time, those accounts were treated as exaggerations, details shaped by distance, retelling, and the tendency to turn unfamiliar cultures into something more extreme than they were. But the pattern doesn't disappear when the stories are set aside. Across different sources, the same idea continues to surface, and when the archaeological record begins to fill the gaps, it doesn't contradict it. Burials dated between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, including those found at sites like the Pazyryk burials, show that human remains were not always left untouched after death. Parts of the body were handled, altered, and in some cases preserved in ways that suggest they were kept, not discarded. And then, in 2023, that uncertainty narrowed. Analysis of Scythian leather artifacts identified traces of human skin, physical evidence that at least some of the objects described in earlier accounts were not symbolic, but real. What happened to the body was not separate from the act of violence. It was part of it. The result of the encounter could be carried forward, worn, displayed, or transformed into something that extended the act beyond the moment it took place. In that sense, the body did not simply mark the end of the encounter, but became part of what the encounter produced, which makes the boundary between violence and its aftermath far less clear than it appears. Because what looks like an ending is, in some cases, only a transition into something that continues in a different form. And in a system like that, the question is no longer just what happens in the moment of the strike, but what continues long after it. But sometimes, what followed couldn't be controlled at all. In the late 7th century, During the First Great Siege of Constantinople between 674 and 678, the Byzantine fleet deployed something that did not behave like any weapon their enemies had encountered before. Fire projected across the surface of the sea, launched from bronze siphons mounted on warships, directed outward in controlled bursts, yet refusing to remain controlled once it made contact. It could be mistaken for a familiar kind of incendiary attack, until the moment it touched water and continued to burn, spreading across the surface instead of dying out, clinging to wood, to sails, and to anything it reached. The response that should have worked, water, distance, retreat, did not follow the expected pattern. The moment it is released, the logic changes. Because the weapon could be aimed and deployed, but its effect could not be contained once it left the source, turning each use into something that continued beyond the point where control should have ended. Contemporary sources described it as sea fire, not just for how it looked, but for how it behaved, spreading across the surface instead of being stopped by it. It was not an isolated use. Decades later, the same system appears again during the siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718, under similar conditions and with similar results, reliable enough to be used repeatedly and effective enough to shape the outcome of entire naval engagements. And yet, even with that level of control at the point of use, something fundamental had changed. Once released, the effect no longer followed the intent behind it. Attempts to counter it are described, but never in a way that suggests a consistent solution. Responses that might reduce it in one case fail in another, always arriving too late to contain what has already begun. The composition of Greek fire remains unknown. Descriptions survive, and its effects are recorded in detail, but the formula itself does not. It was treated as a state secret, restricted and protected, and when the system that sustained it began to collapse, particularly after the fall of Constantinople in 1204, the knowledge that made it possible appears to have disappeared with it. What remains is effect, without explanation. Not just a weapon that behaves outside expectation, but one that can no longer be fully understood, even after centuries of study. Because at that point, the question is no longer how it was used, but how anything like it could be answered once it began. But for others, control was never something to lose, it was something to build. By the late 8th century BCE, within the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the outcome of violence was not only controlled, it was constructed and preserved in a form that remained visible long after the event itself had ended. Across palace walls, carved into stone with deliberate precision, entire sequences unfold. Cities under siege, defenders overwhelmed, prisoners taken, and then what follows? Figures bound, displayed, and subjected to punishments that are not hidden at the margins, but placed at the center of the composition. This wasn't concealed. The scenes were positioned where they would be encountered, repeated across surfaces, integrated into the architecture of power itself, so that the act did not disappear when it was over, but remained present, fixed, and visible. In 701 BCE, during the Assyrian campaign against the siege of Lachish, this process is recorded in full. An entire narrative carved into the walls of a royal palace, showing not only the moment of conquest, but the treatment of those who remained afterward, extending the event beyond the battlefield and into something that could be seen again and again. At first, it could be mistaken for documentation. But the pattern doesn't behave like a record. The same structures appear across different campaigns and different rulers, repeated with enough precision that they stop reflecting what happened and begin to define what comes next. Which means the carvings are not neutral. They are placed and preserved with intent. This wasn't a record, it was a warning. Because what is shown here is not limited to the moment it occurred. It is projected forward, directed at those who would see it next, shaping expectations before any future encounter takes place. The act itself is only part of what's happening. What matters is that it is seen and remembered in a specific way, turning the result of violence into something that operates beyond the event that produced it. The message is consistent. Resistance leads here. And once that message is established, the need to repeat the act in full begins to change. Because at that point, the effect can exist even in its absence, carried forward through what has already been shown, shaping decisions before the first blow is struck. And in a system like that, violence is no longer just an outcome. It becomes a language, one that decides the result before the fight begins. In some places, the message wasn't carved into stone. It was placed where no one could avoid it. Along the roads that led into Roman cities, movement followed a predictable rhythm. Traders, soldiers, travelers, all passing through the same routes that connected one place to another, spaces meant for transit, not for stopping, and not for confrontation. And yet, in those same spaces, something else remained. It was not hidden at the edges or confined to a single location, but placed where it would be encountered. Bodies fixed to wooden crosses, raised above eye level, positioned so that anyone moving along the road would see them long before they reached them, and continue to see them as they passed. You didn't go to see it, you passed by it. In 71 BCE, after the suppression of the uprising led by Spartacus, thousands of individuals were crucified along the route of the Appian Way, extending for miles in a sequence that did not present a single moment of violence, but a continuous one, repeating the same outcome again and again until the road itself became defined by it. There was no single point where it began or ended. The act was not brief. Death could take hours, sometimes longer, and even after it had occurred, the body remained, so that the event did not end when the person died, but continued as long as the image was there, long enough for it to stop being an event and become part of the road. And it was not limited to a single instance. Crucifixion was used repeatedly, applied in different regions and under different circumstances, but always with the same logic of placement and duration, ensuring that the result was not contained within the moment it occurred, but extended outward into the spaces people moved through every day. The message did not need to be delivered directly. It was already present, forcing every person who passed to measure themselves against it. In that sense, violence no longer required an event to carry it forward. It became part of the environment, something that remained in place, defining the space around it and influencing what people chose to do simply by being there. And once it reaches that point, something changes again. Because at that stage, it no longer needs to be repeated in full to have the same effect. And eventually, it didn't need to be there anymore. But in some places, the warning didn't end with the act itself. It became something people were forced to face. In 1462, as the army of Mehmed II advanced into Wallachia, the expectation was simple: movement toward resistance, toward a battle that would resolve the encounter in a way that could be understood. But there was no battle waiting. What stood outside the capital at Targovist was not a line of defense or a position to be taken, but something arranged, rows of wooden stakes rising from the ground, each one holding a body, extending across the landscape in a formation that did not present a single point of focus, but a continuous field that resisted being taken in all at once. At first, it appears as isolated shapes in the distance, vertical lines that do not immediately resolve into anything recognizable. And then, as the distance closes, the pattern begins to take form, not all at once, but piece by piece, repeating until the mind stops trying to separate one from another. It wasn't a battlefield. It was constructed. Accounts describe it as a forest, not because of what it was made of, but because of how it appeared, dense, repeated, and without clear boundary, so that anyone who approached it could not avoid it. There was no single point to focus on. This was the warning Vlad the Impaler wanted them to see. What stands in front is only part of it, with more extending behind, and beyond that, more still. The arrangement mattered as much as the act itself, bodies positioned at varying heights, extending into the distance, creating depth and repetition. And nothing moved. The field remained as it was, fixed in place, leaving no moment to react to, only something that had already happened and could not be changed. Reports from the time describe hesitation, withdrawal, a disruption of momentum, not because the meaning was unclear, but because there was too much of it to absorb at once. There was too much to take in. And once violence reaches that scale, something changes again, because at that point it no longer needs to be seen. What follows isn't another act. It's what is left behind, gathered, shaped, and placed so it remains. By the early 13th century, as the forces of Genghis Khan moved across Central Asia, what followed did not end with the moment of conquest, but continued into what was left behind once the fighting had stopped. where movement and activity had defined a place before. There was now stillness, streets without direction, structures without purpose, and no clear sign of where one moment ended and another began. And within that silence, something remained. Not in the form it had taken during the act itself, but gathered and placed with intent, remains collected and set where they could be seen, not as a continuation of violence but as its result, not because they were needed, but because they would remain longer than the act itself. By 1220, entire regions had already been overrun, and in the aftermath of those campaigns, accounts describe what was left not simply as absence, but as something shaped. Skulls gathered and arranged, forming structures that did not serve a practical purpose, but carried something forward beyond the event that created them. Nothing about this was required to complete the act. The outcome had already been decided. And yet, what remained was not left as it fell, it was altered. Not to continue it, but to make sure it didn't end. At that point, the act itself no longer needed to be repeated to have its effect. What mattered was that something stayed, something that could be encountered later, understood without explanation, and recognized as the result of what had already taken place. In that sense, the violence no longer depended on presence, scale, or even visibility in the moment. It existed in what followed, carried forward in a form that did not require the act to happen again, in order to influence what came next. What it leaves behind is enough, not as an image, not as a structure, but as something carried forward, something that shapes what happens next without needing to appear again. At the beginning, violence was something you could control, used directly, kept within the moment it was meant for. Then it changed. It became something you carried, something that slipped beyond control, something that was shaped into strategy and placed where it couldn't be avoided, and pushed until it no longer needed to be understood. And in the end, violence didn't stay in the act itself. It remained in what was left behind. If one of these stories stayed with you, let it travel. Like the video. Subscribe if you haven't. The search continues here on Riddle Me This Mysteries.